We will move on to Richard Wingfield. He's the head of legal at Global Partners Digital, and he's going to be talking to us about their experience working with tech SMEs, as well as touching on a few areas. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Mwende. Can I just check first of all that you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Great, thank you so much. And it's just a shame that I'm not able to be with some of you in person. I can see a lot of friends on this call and people who it would be great to meet at some point in the future. And thank you so much for inviting me. So Global Partners Digital, the organization that I work for, is a human rights organization trying to make sure that the internet and digital technology, both in its development, its use, and increasingly its regulation, is an environment that supports and enables human rights rather than puts them at risk. And as an organization, we look not only to work with policymakers, looking at governments and parliaments and the legislation and regulation they develop, but we recognize the important and increasingly important role that tech companies play in making sure that human rights are respected and protected. And what I want to do during the time that I have with you today is to have a little bit more of a specific look at the role of tech SMEs. I think quite often when we think about the role that tech companies play when it comes to human rights, we often think of the very biggest global companies who seem to be in the news the most and have the largest impact. And we focus perhaps on 4 or 5, very large companies. Whereas actually there is a huge ecosystem of companies offering different products and services, whether just at the national level or across a region or globally. And actually the human rights impacts can be just as significant. And there's an important role that they play when it comes to human rights protection as well. But I want to touch firstly, before I go into some of the details about the role of the private sector, on what are some of the key issues that we're seeing when it comes to human rights and technology. Last year, GPD, the Global Partners Digital, published a report which looked at some of the key concerns from a human rights perspective of civil society groups across the world. And we identified around 10 major issues on the agenda that we're seeing are a particular concern. I'll share a link to the report in the chat once I finish my remarks. But what's interesting, I think, from that report for this conversation is just how many of those issues are ones that the tech sector plays an incredibly important role in influencing. So a couple of them have been mentioned, I'm aware, during today's presentations. Data protection is probably one of the most prominent. The role that the private sector plays, not just in collecting data, but processing it, using it for targeted advertising or other purposes. Another issue which is related to data is the increasing use of artificial intelligence, with AI systems and technologies, for the most part, designed and developed by the private sector and then either used or sold to governments or third parties. But it's not just data issues that are of concern. The role of tech companies when it comes to freedom of expression online is hugely significant. We know that, and it's a little bit of a cliche to say, but the online platforms are now like the public square of the digital environment. They are the places that we communicate, we share information and news, we learn, we discuss and debate. And we all know how important these platforms are, particularly during times of protest or times of elections, or when there are significant policy issues on the agenda that citizens want to discuss. I know that the issue of network disruptions has been discussed earlier, and of course that's a tool that many governments, unfortunately, around the world are using when they are concerned about some of the information that people are talking about online. But the role, of course, of the private sector here is critical because it is, for the most part, private companies that provide these platforms. And so they play a hugely important role in ensuring freedom of expression. But there are lots of other issues on the agenda as well. I've mentioned AI and the different algorithms and forms of machine learning that private sector companies are developing. Around the issue of digital identification and identity, we're seeing private companies often developing digital ID systems, either for governments or for third-party use. We have concerns around issues like surveillance and the amount of private information that companies capture as well. So there's a huge range of major public policy issues where the private sector has a hugely important role to play. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we just think about the biggest companies, and I appreciate that I'm coming to this from a global north perspective, but certainly in the UK and Europe, all we ever seem to talk about and all governments ever seem to talk about is Facebook, Google, YouTube, and Twitter. as though those are the only 4 companies that exist in the tech ecosystem. But I think SMEs actually also play a really important role, and there should be an increasing focus on their role. And this is for 2 main reasons. First, it's quite possible that even a small company can have significant human rights impacts through the work that it does. And an example that I often look to is Cambridge Analytica, which is a data analytics company, which scrapes, I'm sure you're all aware of this case, but scraped data from Facebook and from quizzes that people undertook, and use this to generate insights and allow for targeted advertising by political parties and during political processes and referendums without any transparency or accountability, and as a result may have had hugely significant impacts on the results of those elections and referendums, even though the individuals involved had no idea that their data was being used in that way, or that they were being targeted with particular forms of advertising or messaging. But Cambridge Analytica was not a global tech company. It was a relatively small company, and yet it had a hugely significant impact when it comes to human rights and to democracy. The other reason why I think it's important to focus on SMEs is that, of course, every global tech company was at one point an SME. Facebook at some point was just a few people working with Mark Zuckerberg in Harvard. Google at some point was just a small company. So we don't know which of the SMEs that exist today are going to be the global tech companies or the regional tech companies of the future. And one of, I think, of the big challenges that we've seen in trying to get the larger companies to think about human rights is that they are already so big, their processes are so well developed, and it's almost impossible to try to influence any kind of cultural change within these monolithic, gigantic organizations. Whereas if you can build an understanding of the importance of human rights at an early stage in a company's development, and you build in human rights respecting processes and systems and cultures at that point, you're far less likely to have risks of human rights issues arising in the future. So I wish maybe some of these conversations had started taking place 20 years ago when the global tech giants of today were SMEs themselves. In our experience as at Global Partners Digital, working with SMEs, and we've worked with SMEs in Europe, across the African continent, in Latin America and South and Southeast Asia, there are obviously huge variations and divergences in what are the most important issues, what is the culture of different companies in different parts of the world, what are the existing legal frameworks, and often, of course, it's legislation that drives what companies do. But we have seen some consistent themes emerge in our work, which might be useful to share with you. The first relates to the opportunities that exist. There are obviously some challenges when it comes to working with smaller companies, but I want to start on a positive note with the opportunities. I think it's fair to say that there is an increasing understanding by companies of all sizes of the role that trust and confidence by users and customers plays in whether they're going to be a successful business or not. Issues around data protection in particular are only increasing on the political agenda, but also on the public agenda as well. People are increasingly concerned about data, whether that comes through sharing information on websites, such as personal financial information or health information, whether it's having more devices in our homes that listen to what we say and those kind of assistant-based devices. And as has been mentioned, increasing awareness that we're now interacting more with bots and machines and less with people. So I think people are beginning to understand that information and data is a risk when it comes to sharing it with private companies. And so a company that can tell you that they have really strongly considered privacy and other human rights or user rights impacts is likely to be a company that's going to garner more trust and confidence. And therefore, it's going to increase their financial opportunities to grow their share of the particular market in which they operate. So there is a bit of an open door sometimes when talking to companies. No company wants to be involved in a scandal, and violations of human rights or users' rights is of course a scandal. And perhaps in the same way that maybe years ago you had companies who were involved in very physical human rights issues, for example, unsafe working conditions or dangerous environmental impacts, we're now recognizing, or rather we're seeing companies recognize that impacts related to data and online human rights can be just as damaging as some of the more physical human rights issues of the past. The second is looking at the role of investors. So obviously, if you're an SME, particularly if you're starting to scale up to a significant size, you're going to be looking for investment from some kind of investment company or from angel investors or whatever the case may be. And investors themselves are also increasingly aware of the importance of an ethical or a human rights-based approach that companies should be taken. They don't want to invest in a company that's going to be involved in a human rights violation or a large scandal. And so what we've seen over the last few years is a real growth in what we would say ethical investing. So these are investors who only invest in companies that can demonstrate their compliance and consistency with human rights or ethical standards. We're also seeing investors increasingly intervene when it's companies that they are financially supporting, where they are concerned that the company is going down a route that might be financially beneficial, but creates risks to users' rights, to ethics, or to human rights, and becoming increasingly active either through direct intervention or joint statements or letters, or by modifying the criteria by which they make and support investments. So that's the second reason, is that if you want to be a company that's got the maximum opportunity to garner investment, you want to be thinking about these issues at a very early stage. And then third and finally, I would point to legal compliance. So there's been some discussion today already around Kenya's new data protection law, and I think it's about 100 countries now, so just over half of the world has some form of data protection legislation. So thinking about human rights like privacy is actually a good thing because it bolsters your legal compliance. If you're already taking steps to protect your users, including their human rights, you're much more likely to be compliant with legislation around things like consumer protection, data protection. Also, if you're a company that wants to trade, if you want to offer your products and services outside of Kenya, particularly in countries with strong data protection laws, such as in the European Union with its GDPR, you need to be aware of those standards as well. So if you can demonstrate strong human rights compliance domestically, it's going to be much easier for you to trade and be compliant with the legal requirements of the other countries where you want to offer your products and services. So those are kind of three perhaps opportunities that exist, the interest among companies when it comes to the trust and confidence of their consumers and customers, the increasing role that investors are playing when it comes to ethical and human rights-based investments, and the benefits for legal compliance. But there are, of course, some challenges, and there are perhaps three challenges that we've seen consistently across the world and which may resonate in the Kenyan context as well. The first, of course, is that if you are a small company with a small team, you are very unlikely to have human rights expertise internally. Facebook may have a whole human rights team and Google may have a whole human rights team, but smaller companies are often with smaller numbers of staff may not even have somebody who works on policy issues at all. One of the responses to this challenge, of course, is to encourage companies to work with NGOs and others who do have that expertise. So building relationships between companies that care about human rights and organizations, whether it's BAKE, whether it's academic institutions like SIPIT, but working with domestic experts who can understand and help a company think through its human rights risks and think of solutions to mitigate them. The second, of course, is competing pressures. So if you're a small company, yes, of course, you want to sort of think about maybe sort of privacy protections or data protection issues, but this can often come or can be seen to compete with economic incentives. So you want to be, growing your business and innovating and using data for all sorts of exciting purposes to try new products and services. So there are sometimes competing pressures between economic benefits and protecting human rights. And to address that concern, I would really go back to the point I made at the start, which is that if you are a company that ultimately ends up in some kind of scandal or some data protection leak or breach, you put your entire company's reputation at risk. And so it's important to make sure that that is also as much a part of your consideration as growth and other financial or economic related concerns. And then finally, on a very specific issue, one of the things that companies are often asked to do when it comes to protecting human rights is to resist actions by government. And that can be demands for data by law enforcement agencies. It can be demands by government to remove certain pieces of content, to block accounts, to shut down the systems or the service that they operate during a period of a network disruption or an internet shutdown. That is a really difficult thing to ask a small company to do, is to resist government. But there are tools and resources out there to help companies think through that particularly challenging situation of resisting government demands. And I'll share a couple of those later, but we have a document called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which offers guidance to companies on how to address human rights concerns and what they should do in situations where they're being forced to comply with something that might be a human rights violation. There's also the guiding principles and the implementation guidelines from a network of companies called the Global Network Initiative. So this is a network of tech companies, as well as civil society organizations, investors, and others that look at the role that the tech sector plays, particularly around privacy and freedom of expression. And they produce these guidelines which help companies think about ways that they can either push back on government demands or comply with them, but in a very narrow way. So there are guidance documents out there which help companies in these situations. And again, I'll share links to these, to the guiding principles and the GNI principles in the chat. I can see that there's been a question which I might just answer before I come to my final remarks from Charles, which is looking at some of the data protection issues relating to children. I think the major issue when it comes to data protection in children is the issue of consent. I think we've got a pretty good idea of what consent means from an adult. We've now developed quite strong standards that means that adults need to be aware of what data they're providing, what it's going to be used for, and how they can exercise control over that data, i.e. by amending it, requesting its deletion, or just obtaining a copy of it when they sign up to use a particular company's products or services. The issue of consent for children, though, is very different, of course, because children will often, particularly younger children, not have the maturity or the understanding to know exactly what data they're sharing, what it might be used for, and will just consent without a full appreciation. And that's why there's been some efforts by legislators to try to create stronger standards for data protection for children, either by prohibiting certain forms of data that can be collected from children at all. So, for example, you might say if you're a child, you can't upload photographs of yourself, which could be quite sort of personal. You can't upload information about your health status. You might limit the information that can be shared to something like your name, maybe your age, and maybe the country you live in, and not anything more than that. And maybe not even your surname, just your first name. It might mean for some older children thinking about ways that you can verify the age of the person who's using the product or service. So, for example, introducing some kind of authentication, either using an identity document or some other way to make sure that children are not using the platform, or that they're above a certain age before they can do. That, of course, raises its own privacy concerns about requiring people to share personal data to prove their age. But that's another area of growth where I think people are looking at making sure that children are protected from the risks to their data being shared. But I think it's on top of all of that, it's also important to make sure that steps aren't taken which prevent children from accessing the online environment at all. We wouldn't want a situation where you had to be 18 to use the internet, to use technology, to gain the educational benefits that come from the internet. And so I think it's important to strike a balance between the strong protections for children's privacy that we must ensure, but making sure that as a result, they're not excluded from the benefits of technology and of the internet. The very last thing that I want to say before I wrap up, and I'm happy to answer any questions, is maybe some simple steps that smaller companies can think about if they are interested in human rights, and which might be useful levers for advocacy. The first is just, as I mentioned earlier, just to start engaging with others. And that means that other companies who take an interest in human rights, including larger companies who might have more experience, maybe even telcos that have thought about these issues before as well, but NGOs, academic institutions, and independent experts. And there are lots of networks out there who are looking at the role of the tech sector when it comes to human rights. The second is to make sure you have buy-in from across the organization, all the way from your senior management and your board to day-to-day product developers. It's really important to embed a culture of human rights within the organization and not just within one individual. So thinking about how you can build the capacity internally is a really important element as well. As I mentioned, there are a number of existing tools and resources. We're not starting from scratch here. The GPD website has a whole page of business and human rights resources for tech companies, which I'll share on the chat in just a moment as well. And as I mentioned, there are things like the UN Guiding Principles, the GNI Principles, and the work of international organizations like the United Nations, who have a whole project called the BTech Project, which is all about helping tech companies think about human rights issues. So there are loads of resources out there. Finally, a few things that companies can do. How about just making a statement, a public policy that you care about human rights, and demonstrating that visibly to your users and your customers? And that can set out the things that you're going to do, whether that's building an internal understanding of human rights, introducing things like human rights due diligence, so you constantly are keeping aware by talking to stakeholders of some of the risks that might be emerging, having a contact point so that people with concerns of issues relating to privacy have someone to talk to, And then very finally, before I finish, transparency. These are often very difficult and challenging issues, but one thing that companies can do far better is just being transparent about them. And that is talking publicly about the challenges that they face, about the trade-offs that are involved when it comes to human rights and other considerations, about the demands that they get from third parties, including governments, to remove data, to remove content, or to share data. So transparency publicly is something we're seeing companies increasingly do. And it's a very, in some ways, straightforward step of showing as a company that you are thinking about these issues, even if they are difficult and you don't always have the answers to them. I can see that there is one more question that's come up in the chat, and then I promise I will stop. And this is from Kennedy, looking at the way that pictures of children from poorer communities are sometimes used to encourage funding for particular campaigns or causes. I think this raises a number of ethical questions that go beyond simply human rights and privacy. I think there's a huge ethical question about whether it is exploitative to show images of children as a way of trying to raise money, often where children may not even be aware of their photo being taken at all, or what purposes it's going to be used for. And this is not just going to be a picture that goes into a magazine somewhere like years ago. This could be a public picture that's uploaded online and is then permanently stored and available for the rest of their lives, with a particular framing related to perhaps poverty that is going to not necessarily affect them, but will be connected to them. So I think there are really big ethical concerns about doing this and making sure that where children are involved in these kinds of photographs or videos, that both they and their parents have a full understanding of why images or videos are being taken, for what purposes, how they can make sure that it's only used for a limited period, perhaps, and when they can, and how they're able to demand that it's not going to be used. There are, of course, benefits in using visuals, including images and videos, to obtain funding. But I think some of those ethical and privacy related issues are going to be more important now than ever before, as these images and videos become permanent rather than just sort of temporary in the way that they perhaps were in the past. So I will stop there, conscious of time, but very happy to stay online until the end of the webinar and to answer any more questions that there may be from people.